Hi, welcome to History 315D, Plato to NATO, A History of Ideas in the West. My name is David Millard. I'll be your instructor for the next 7 weeks. I'm trying a bit of an experiment today. I'm going to give the first lecture, which is basically an introduction to the class and going over the syllabus. I'm doing that via YouTube. So I know the sound isn't that great, and so I'm not going to be doing this a lot going forward, but I thought for the first class it would be nice to give you guys a chance to see who I am and see me at least in this very restricted frame in my native environment. I don't know if you can see it, but if you look that way, that's downtown San Francisco. And if you look back this way, that's me. So, where do we start? Let's start talking a little generally about philosophy. What is philosophy? Your book gives several different pieces of what philosophy is, namely things like epistemology and logic and metaphysics and ethics and political philosophy and aesthetics. So those are some subgenres of political philosophy, of philosophy, and I thought I'd go through them really briefly to give you sort of a really shorthand version of what they mean, which should be helpful to you when you run across them as you're reading through the texts. So let's start off with epistemology. How do we know stuff is basically what epistemology is about. And what is knowledge? It's sort of a question of how we look at, or not how we look at, but how we know things. Logic is really centered around the rules of thinking and drawing conclusions and not getting confused when we're thinking about philosophical things. Metaphysics is the study of first principles, of first causes. In that way, religion is really metaphysical. It's a sort of a different kind of metaphysics, but it really is in search of things like first causes, first movers, that sort of thing. Ethics. Ethics, what is right and wrong? How do we determine right and wrong? How do we relate to right and wrong? And ethics really is bound up in the first three. And in addition to the first three, a whole idea of what it means to be human. And in fact, the question of ethics really is sort of bound up in the, how would I say it? The question of ethics really inspires the first three. In other words, the question of how do we behave better, how do we become better people, and how do we relate to each other really brings about the question of how do we know things and how do we think carefully, and what are the first ideas, the first movements, the first causes. So moving on from ethics, political philosophy, which is basically applied ethics as they're applied to society. And finally, aesthetics, which centers around art and beauty and our human reaction to them. So there are 5 different subcategories, if you will, 5 different flavors of philosophy. But in the end, philosophy is really about thinking about things that aren't readily apparent, things that don't really reduce themselves to other ways of thinking. And I think that's best exemplified by the fact that where we start in ancient Greece, the philosophers that we're looking at didn't confine themselves to the five pieces of philosophy that we just talked about. Aristotle talked about nature a lot, in fact, and Plato also worked in mathematics and a bit in physics. So you'll find that these guys, back in the infancy of the other sciences as we know them, these guys were involved in thinking about them because they weren't sorted out, and we didn't really have the kind of background that we have now in them. And so they were sort of at the edge of thought. And so the difference between, say, physics and philosophy really wasn't that distant at all at that time. And you can sort of see this when you look at the frontiers of modern ways of thinking in the sciences, for instance. If you take a look at physics and you look at astrophysics and theoretical astrophysics and cosmology, it's sort of at the very edges of those fields. The thought really sort of turns a lot more to philosophy than it does to what we traditionally think of as physics. So philosophy really is about thinking at these edges and asking why, and then asking why again, and asking why after that, and again and again and again, and responding to every response to that with, well, is that really the case? So it's really about questioning repeatedly and questioning deeply and questioning as honestly and rigorously as we can. So that's my interpretation of philosophy. Let's move on and talk a bit about me. My name is David Millard again, and I'm a PhD in political science, political philosophy. I got my degree from the University of California, Riverside, and I studied primarily moral philosophy, particularly moral philosophy in France in the early part of the 20th century. Albert Camus was the author that I spent the most time studying, and I was looking at how he formulated his idea of morality within a universe, within a cosmos, if you will, that had sort of been defined by Nietzsche as one that was empty and devoid of first movers and didn't have something like anything like a god or something like science that would give us answers to how we should behave ethically and morally. So that was my main interest, and in the process of going through school, I read all of these authors and spent quite a bit of time thinking about them, sometimes more than I would have liked. My head hurt an awful lot. Hopefully we'll be able to get through this class without making your head hurt too much. So with that in mind, let us take a quick look at the syllabus. This is, of course, an online class, which means that we don't have any set meeting times. And in spite of that, I do want to hold office hours this time because I think it's important that you have an opportunity to give me a call and ask me any questions that you might have that you're wondering about. And a lot of times, especially with this kind of class, with these kinds of ideas, we can cover a lot more ground on the phone, speaking face-to-face, so to speak, than we can via an email conversation or a chat conversation. So I've set office hours for Wednesdays at 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. and I'm sure that may not work for everybody in the class, so I have added my phone number to the syllabus. You may have an earlier version of the syllabus that does not have that, but I've added my phone number to that and I'll post it so that you can be sure to have that. Please feel free to call me anytime up to about 10 p.m. Pacific time, so that's 1 o'clock Eastern, 1 a.m. Eastern. So right now the office hours are on a conference line, which means that more than one person can be talking to me at the same time. I think that's a great opportunity for us to share ideas if that opportunity arises. If you want to discuss something more personal, please call me on my